could never sleep well in hotels. I guess that's somewhat of an understatement. I could never sleep well in general. But hotels were the worst. Just the thought that the previous occupant of this bed is a complete stranger was repulsive in my mind. But that's beside the point. What I'm getting at is how this lack of sleep in hotels changed my life. Christmas. We were spending Christmas in a shitty hotel and not with family. Great. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I didn't enjoy the all-you-can-eat buffet of soggy hash browns and grits for Christmas Eve dinner. Of course, the first snow of the season had to cancel our flight to Virginia. It was Christmas Eve and I was trying to sleep in this bleach-saturated room. My mind was wandering what happened in here to cause such an excessive amount of bleach needed. The room was nothing out of the ordinary. 2 beds, one for me and my dad, another for my sister and Mama, a bathroom, and a stained microwave that looked in need of a good dusting. Somehow, I escaped the room, and the smell of bleach, into a dreamless sleep. Waking up, I could tell it was early morning. My dad was next to me, snoring, and he usually wakes up before 4 a.m. That's when it hit me. It's Christmas, and I was about to let this bad fortune ruin my favorite holiday. Looking across the bed at the clock to check the time is when I noticed it. The silhouette of a man, about 6'3", across the room, staring at my mama, asleep. Still half asleep and caught up in the moment, I couldn't help thinking of Santa Claus. I realized how stupid the thought was, and horror soon filled my head. I choked back a shriek. I knew I couldn't let him see me awake, so I quietly put my head back down, pretending to sleep. My mind was racing. Someone was in my room, and I couldn't do nothing. I was a scrawny 16-year-old kid. This man looked built like an ox. I wondered if I could wake my dad up in time, but I knew that wouldn't work. He slept like a rock. A bucket of water couldn't get him up fast enough. I was practically in tears. I'd never felt so helpless. For a second time, I choked back a scream. He was standing next to me, and I could feel and hear his repulsive breath on my face. It smelled like he'd been eating rotten meat for a week now, with no thought to brush his teeth. If he didn't know I was awake, surely he did now, seeing my face was contorted in fear. The breathing stopped, and I couldn't help the sigh of relief. I would have kicked myself, but there was no need. I heard the room door open and close. I launched out of bed. Nothing in the room was in disarray, and my family was still asleep. That couldn't have been a dream. I couldn't have imagined it. Feeling awake as ever, a horrible idea popped in my head. Before I could push it away, I was pulling the door open. Glancing back at the door in order to memorize the room number, I saw the giant spray-painted black X on the door. Had I seen this without the prior experience, I probably would have thought it was just some stupid kids. I knew better. Not enough to know what it was for. My heart skipped a beat. There he was, turning the corner at the end of the hall. Why am I doing this? I tailed him down to the parking lot. He was nowhere in sight. One moment he's walking out the lobby, the next he's gone. Realizing how cold it is outside in paper-thin pajamas, I returned to the lobby. No one was around. Strange. I could swear there's usually a night concierge. Adrenaline wearing off, I realized how stupid and rash my actions had been. He could have killed me. I cursed myself back up them stairs. I knew something was wrong when I got to my floor, and the door to my room was wide open. I hadn't left it that way, right? I walked inside, and after a quick search of the room, I determined it's safe and my family still asleep. I locked the door and got back into bed, though I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I listened to my daddy get up, and eventually my mama followed. but I still pretended to be asleep. A few hours passed, and my parents got my sister and I up. We got in the car and made our way back to the airport. Digging through my bag to grab my iPod led to the finding of something that hadn't been in there the previous day. A note that simply held the 5 words I still think about to this day. I knew you were awake. It's now been 2 months since the hotel experience. I'm still scared for my life, and it gets worse every day. That note that I found wasn't the only one. I still receive them. Hi, everyone. This is my first time in a session like this, so I don't really know how to start. I guess it makes sense to start with my name. My name is Anna Fick. Anna, short for Anastasia. I'm an only child, born in a small town in Minnesota, but we moved down to Oklahoma when I was just a baby. I grew up in the suburbs, which was a bit boring, but nice enough in its own way. Still, I was aching to run off to college in the big city. I wasn't really attached to anyone back home. I'm kind of a loner, and I don't go out of my way to make friends. College would be the perfect opportunity to really start my life, you know? College was where I first met Ruby. Ruby was... well, she was really something. I met her when I moved into my freshman dorm, room 122. She was just across the hall in room 123. I'd moved in before my roommate, so Ruby was the first person I met. She came bouncing over with her curly brown hair and glittering blue eyes and welcomed me to the community.
You must be Anna, right?
She came flying in just as Dad and I were struggling to set up my lofted bed.
From Oklahoma?
Yeah, hi. I extended my hand, leaving my dad to fight alone. You are...
My name is Ruby. Ruby Somers. I live just across the hall from you.
Her eyes sparkled bright against the freckles peppered across her face.
I'm hoping we can be friends. Just let me know if you need anything, okay?
I glanced into her room and saw her perfectly lofted bed. Well, actually, I think my dad and I could use your expertise in loft building. She lent a hand, and we had the bed lofted in no time, becoming close friends in the process. Sorry, I guess that's not really important. I just want you guys to know, okay? That's the kind of person Ruby was. The kind who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return. Anyway, after that, I started to spend most of my time with Ruby. We went through orientation week together. Without Ruby, I don't think I'd have met anyone else. She was really into those stupid icebreakers. Normally, I hate them. But somehow she managed to make it really fun. I made lots of friends that first week, all thanks to Ruby. But no matter how many friends I made, Ruby was still special. We quickly became best friends. We ate together, had movie nights together, went to class together. We even went through the town's nearby haunted house together. Several times, in fact. Ruby and I grew ever closer over the rest of the semester. And as we got closer, I realized that there was a lot of stuff I didn't know about her. Her scar, for instance. I noticed it during one of our sleepovers. We'd been watching horror movies all night when I saw the thin pink line tracing down her collarbone and disappearing under her nightshirt. Hey, Ruby, what is that? She turned to look at me as I traced the path of her scar along my own skin. That was the first time I saw Ruby's eyes turn grim. Those blue eyes became dull like stone, and I saw something inside her just shut down.
I don't like to talk about that.
I could feel the ground beneath us become shaky as I pressed on. But why not? That was when she lifted her eyes to mine, those painful, dull eyes, as she let me in on a little secret.
My past was not always a happy place. There are things that I can forget if I try. If you'll help me, I'd like to try.
I know. that doesn't sound like much of a secret. But you have to understand, you have to! Everyone thought that Ruby was the happiest girl in the world. The fact that at one point in her life she'd had so much pain that it darkened those eyes, that was something she'd never willingly tell anyone. Well, anyone except me. So I helped her, just like she asked. I never brought up the scar again. We couldn't rewrite her past, but the future we created would be fresh and new. It'd be beautiful, and we created it together. I had my hand in creating all our happiest memories, and she in turn became a part of all of mine. Ruby tried to forget. I think most of the time she succeeded, but sometimes thin cracks split up from her past, shattering into her present like lightning. The first time it happened was when I told her about my family. I told her that I had been born in Minnesota, and something on her face changed.
Minnesota? Where in Minnesota?
I remember thinking it was odd, that strange dullness that came into her eyes. I learned quickly that the dullness was the pain of a scar that had never really healed. Oh, I don't remember. Some little town somewhere? We didn't live there very long, anyway. She relaxed, and the vibrancy sprung back into her blue eyes. I didn't remember the incident until after everything. The second time was much more serious. This time, I could see the cracks run a little deeper, spread a little farther. We'd been heading toward the dining hall together when she slapped her palm to her forehead.
Oh, crap! I have to go to the financial aid office, quick! I forgot. Hey, Anna, you want to come with me? It should only take a second. They said I needed to clear up some paperwork.
So we found ourselves sitting in the waiting room gossiping about something stupid, when the receptionist called out,
Ruby Fick.
Ruby's face drained of color. Her eyes had that strange dead look in them, but this time there was something almost inhuman, smoldering underneath the surface. She stalked up to the counter, with me following in her wake, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach.
What did you say?
Ruby's voice was soft and sharp as her eyes fell like lead on the poor receptionist. The slight woman looked pretty taken aback.
I called for Miss Ruby Thick. Is that you?
My name is not Fick.
The words seethed out of her throat like smoke, filling the air with poisonous tension. The woman's mouth hung slack as Ruby continued.
My name is Somers. Ruby Somers. I told the school that my name is Somers.
The receptionist looked back at her notes.
Well, that actually seems to be the problem with your financial aid. Regardless of the name you want to use, the name on the form is—
I don't care about the fucking farm!
Ruby's voice cracked into the air like a whip, and a fire burned out in her eyes. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her out of the office, terrified that the receptionist was gonna call campus security. Once we finally got outside, I grabbed Ruby by the shoulders and stared hard into her eyes. They'd begun to return to normal, but I could see the strain. I could see the cracks. Ruby, what happened back there? Why did they get your name wrong?
Don't, Anna.
Ruby wouldn't meet my gaze, but I didn't budge. Ruby, I'm your best friend. You can tell me these things. I'm here to protect you, remember? Besides, the thought made me uncomfortable, but I spoke it out loud anyway. My name is Fick. Isn't that odd?
It's not odd,
Ruby said fiercely.
Fick is a common name, one of the most common in the U.S. I don't go by it anymore, so what does it matter? I don't like it, Anna. Can't we just forget it?
Forget. You know, that's what Ruby thought she needed. To forget. And now, I wonder, did I do wrong? Was I wrong to try to help her? Despite these few instances, Ruby and I remain close. She had a place in my heart that, until she got there, I didn't realize existed. She made me realize parts of myself, and I thought that was really beautiful. I really loved her, you know? As much as anyone can love another person. Well, everything led up to Christmas break. At Christmas break, Everyone returns to their hometowns, to their families and their past lives. That's why I offered to let Ruby stay with my family for the break. She wanted to forget. We could help her do that. She could have a happy family Christmas with me, another memory to add to our collection. She was pretty excited to be going with me. As we rode the bus the few hours back to Oklahoma, she asked me,
Hey, what should I call your parents?
Well, I just call them Mom and Dad, I teased. She rolled her eyes at me, but I could see the laughter in them.
Yeah, very funny. What are their names?
In an offhand sort of way, I said, My mom's name is Rachel. She's from Iowa. My dad's name is Brian. He's the one from Minnesota. I got to this point in my introductions when I noticed that something was wrong with Ruby again.
You said Brian? Brian Fick?
Yeah, why? She turned to look out of the window, her voice coming from some faraway place.
Oh, no reason. Just curious.
The rest of the trip was spent in silence. Ruby was somewhere in her own head, and it made me uneasy. But that was all right. Soon she'd be home with me and everything would be fine. I was so excited to share my home with her. Ruby put on a sweet face when we saw my parents again. They'd remember her from move-in day. How could you forget a face like Ruby's? You couldn't. We chatted in the living room for a while, Ruby, Dad, and I, while Mom finished up supper.
So, Anna tells me you guys originally lived in Minnesota. Whereabouts did you live? My family's from there, too.
I looked at Ruby, shocked. She'd never told me that before. I mean, she'd never told me anything about her past. My dad looked a little uncomfortable, too. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I thought I saw tension play out across his eyes.
Oh, just a little town called Slayton. Heard of it?
Ruby's eyes told me she'd definitely heard of it. Those cracks were yawning deep into an abyss that I'd only glimpsed before.
Nope, can't say I have. Must be further south.
Dad looked relieved and Ruby smiled. The tension dissipated and they chatted happily, while I was left feeling distinctly uncomfortable, out of place. We went to bed that night and I thought maybe a night's sleep would help. Ruby was probably just tired. Maybe something about Christmas was stressful for her. Of course, it's a holiday and she clearly doesn't spend holidays with her family. It would take time for her to adjust. I'd wait. That was the night. The last night I spent with Ruby. I woke up around 3 a.m., the witching hour. The moonlight was streaming in through my childhood window as I shifted in my bed. Ruby was sleeping down the hall, and I wondered for half a second if I should go check on her. Except I didn't have to. As I sat up to readjust my pillow, I saw the glint of her eyes staring at me from the door. Ruby? Is something wrong? Her hand shifted nervously, and something glinted at me.
Brian Fick. I've heard that name before.
Ruby's voice was soft. That's how I knew something was wrong. Ruby was never soft, you know? She was always bright and gleaming. That softness was a sickness she carried deep down inside her, like rot.
I heard it a lot growing up. Growing up in Slayton, Minnesota.
I stood up, not really sure what I was going to do, but I ended up not having a choice. The glint in Ruby's hand was long and thin, and it set my hackles up when I realized it was a knife.
Why did you leave Slayton, Anna? Why did you go? Can you tell me that?
I don't know what
Did you know you have an uncle, Anna?
I blinked back at her, confused. No, I don't. My mother only has sisters, and my dad's an only child.
Is he now?
She stepped toward me. I stumbled back against my nightstand. She was running the blade of the knife along her fingers as though she were using it to taste her own skin.
Haven't you ever met your father's family, Anna?
My grandparents on that side have already passed away, so Something was beginning to feel very wrong about this, and it wasn't just Ruby and her knife. Something felt strange. Ruby shuffled another step toward me.
Peter Fick. That's your uncle, Anna. I wonder if your father and Peter were ever very close.
My head was spinning. No, this wasn't right. Something about this was wrong. I wanted to call out, but something stopped me. Something in my brain said, no, stop, you have to hear this.
You know, the thing about Peter is that he's a monster. Not like in those old urban legends you like to read either. No, he's the kind of monster that only a human can be. The kind of monster that likes to torture his own family.
Her hand traced slowly up her scar. The other hand gripped the handle of the knife even tighter.
He's a murderer too, you know,
she whispered, those eyes filling up with the darkness spilling out of her cracks.
He murdered his wife and her mother in front of their only child.
She raised the knife slowly as I hitched my breath.
His blood runs in your veins, Anna, just like it runs in mine.
She swung at me, and I pounced. I screamed for my father as I pinned Ruby to the floor. She was far gone at that point, but I was still stronger than she was. My father held her down while my mother called the cops. His face spelled out anguish as she kept screaming.
Peter Fick! 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 Ah! Oh!
After the police arrived and took Ruby away, my father broke down to me. We were sitting at the police station, waiting to be questioned, as his head sat heavy in his hands. My mother was pale and ghostly, shadowing him with her hands on his shoulders as he told me the story.
Yes, Peter was my brother. I don't consider him as such anymore.
His voice was trembling.
He was always a bad kid, even when we were growing up. I couldn't stand him. He really seemed to have settled down when he got married, but I should have known it couldn't really change him. Soon after the wedding, rumors started spreading throughout Slayton. I heard about what Peter was doing to his wife. Even when they had a kid on the way, I thought she might lose the baby after a few of the incidents. Eventually, I tried to confront Peter, but it was too much. He went crazy, screaming at me to mind my own damn business. The weeks after that became hell. You wouldn't remember, Anna, you'd just been born, but the house was vandalized several times. Peter slashed my tires, started leaving us threats, careful not to leave his name anywhere so we couldn't prove anything, even after we went to the cops. We finally decided it wasn't safe there. I cut off all contact with Peter, we packed our things and left. I haven't been back since.
My father took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand crawling up to his shoulder to grasp my mother's hand.
A few years back, I got a call from an old friend back in Slayton. Peter's wife had tried to divorce him and take their child. They were staying in a hotel for a few days as her mom went down to meet them. She was going to drive them to her house in South Dakota where they'd be safe. He caught them coming out of church. They had been planning to leave right after, his wife and her mother. He shot them on the steps of the church as their child watched. Peter went away for a long time. I'm sure he's still in jail. He'll probably never get out. But the child... I never asked what happened to it. I should have looked into it. I should have offered to help, but what could I do? For God's sake, it was my own brother that had slaughtered his family.
The officer called me in for questioning then, so my father's tale was cut short. But he told me all I needed to know. I sat down in front of the officer, numb and silent. He had to repeat his first few questions several times before they registered. My brain was blasting, one thought on repeat. Ruby was my cousin. Since then, I've tried to talk to Ruby. I really did. I wanted more than anything to help her. But the cracks were too deep, and somehow she fell inside. The girl I knew, the girl I cared about so much, she's gone now. My best friend, the best friend I've ever had, she's gone.
You're the same as him.
She hissed to me the last time I tried to see her.
You're just the same. His blood poisoned you, just like it did me.
She cackled for a moment, then went silent. She looked around, confused, as though she'd forgotten where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then she saw me and remembered.
Stay away from me. I hate you. If you come here again, I'll kill you.
Ruby was declared unfit to stand trial. She's locked away now. She's locked away, and ironically, it's my fault. Me, the one person who just wanted to help her. Ruby, I just wanted to help you. I'm sorry, I'm crying again. This is the first time I've told anybody about what happened. My therapist said it would make me feel better, but all I feel is my heart shattering to pieces all over again. I just wish I could make her understand how sorry I am. I just wanted to help her forget. Instead, it's because of me that she was forced to remember everything. And now I've lost her forever. It was the Christmas of 1965, before man had landed on the moon, before the wall had fallen, before many things good and bad. For me, it was the last time that I knew innocence, before the creeping shadow which engulfed my family, before the madness, before death, before. It was the Advent calendar, that damn thing which I had to have. Each door a promise of Christmas, and each window a misted reminder of the warmth and kindness of the festive season. I was 9 years old, and while the parents in my neighborhood would have had no fears for their children in the past, allowing them to play freely in the icy December streets, those days were lost like breath on a mirror. If snow had fallen, there would have been no joy, no snowball fights in the darkened evenings, no sledges sliding carefree down the fields nearby. Children could not be children. Though the young may have felt apprehension in the dark, it was the parents who were the most fearful, terrified of the ultimate loss, a pain they could never extinguish. For the previous 3 Christmases, without fail, the worst had happened. A child went missing. While I was very young, I remember it all as though it were yesterday. The suburb where we lived had become the most somber of places. Such a tragedy can do that, slowly draining away any hope or happiness from a community, like blood from an open wound. No Christmas tree nor carol sang could stem the flow. The first to disappear was Tommy Graham. He was 11 years old, and although I'd seen him around, I didn't really know him personally. I remember my mother crying about it. Just the thought of something terrible happening to a child distressed her greatly, and the pain that the parents must have been going through was often on her lips. That Christmas, my dad held on to me tighter than he had ever done before, and I could tell they were affected terribly by the disappearance, just as the rest of the community had been. The following year, another Christmas came, and another child was taken. Her name was Cheryl, and she was only 4 years old, tiny and fragile. Tears were shed, misplaced rage vented toward the police, who were unable to find her. And by New Year it was the commonly held view that, like Tommy the year before, little Cheryl would never be found. I, like many of my friends, had been scared by the vanishing children. It was the first time that I became aware that adults could do harm, even to the most vulnerable of us. The children were not always safe, and that those bigger and stronger than us could have unspeakable things on their minds. Yes, I had heard the fairy tales and frightening stories of the Pied Piper and the Bogeyman, but what was going on in our suburb was far more gut-wrenching, far more real than any tall tale. Despite the impact, it was not until the third child disappeared that I was truly heartbroken. His name was Finn, and he was one of my friends, a close one at that. We lived on the same street, playing football in a field by his house and walking to and from school together each day. My dad used to take us to the movies most Sundays, buying us each a hot dog, and when we got home, Mom would serve us a beautiful Sunday roast. Finn was like part of the family, and I still think about him to this day. Where would he have been now? What would he have done with his life? How diminished have we been, not knowing that boy or the adult he would have become? No laughs, no tears together, just an empty seat at the movies, a vacant desk in the classroom. I remember his blue eyes and blonde hair more than anything for some reason. That and his happy-go-lucky nature. I missed him then, and even now I wish it were not true. Like the others, Finn had been snatched from his bed as he slept on that most peaceful of nights, Christmas Eve. His parents had tucked him in, hanging his stocking over the fireplace, kissing his forehead, whispering a Merry Christmas as he fell asleep. They woke expecting to hear the excited scampering footsteps of their son rushing down the stairs to see what Santa had brought, what wrapped secret boxes he had left by the tree, and instead were confronted with an empty bed, the loss of their only child, and an open window sucking in the biting frost of Christmas Day. The parents of all three children would not let go, could not, nor would they assume the worst. Search parties were organized. Flyers were continually posted through letterboxes, pasted onto bulletin boards and shop windows across the city, and the hope was always there that somehow, somewhere, the three children would be found, unharmed and ready to come home. That year, on the 28th of November, 1965, all hope was extinguished. In an old sewage pipe across town, the crumpled, fragile bodies of Tommy, Cheryl, and dear Finn were found stuffed unceremoniously into a corroded pipe in an old sewer, rotting in the waters below. The pain was palpable, the families inconsolable, and for all of us who knew any of the victims, it was to be a bleak and shadow-ridden Christmas. 3 days later, the month turned. Eyes moved toward Christmas and the shaking fear that something cruel and callous lived amongst us all. 3 children in 3 years, now into the 4th? What would happen that Christmas Eve? Which family would be broken? Which child torn from its comfy warm bed, dreaming of Santa, only to be killed and discarded like a piece of fetid waste? My parents were nervous, and who could blame them? I sensed the change in the atmosphere around the streets where I usually played. Families pulling their children in earlier and earlier before dark came. At night, on more than one occasion, I heard hammering echoing out from an unseen source, no doubt windows being nailed shut to prevent any more children being snatched as they slept. On the 1st of December, my dad hung our Christmas lights outside along the gutter of our roof, little beads of glowing color piercing through each cold winter night. We tried to continue on as normal and think of happier times. As always, he asked me to help.
"You're my wingman, kiddo,"
he'd say from behind his bright red scarf, clambering up a set of wooden ladders to the roof above. He had flown for the Air Force before I was born and still used the lexicon of those days in the military. But I didn't mind. It made me feel special. In previous years, I had been too small, too young to be of any real use in decorating the outside of our home. But my dad always included me. I think he just liked to do things with me, to have some father-daughter time. Standing at the bottom of the ladder, looking up at him whistling Christmas songs, made me feel like part of the accomplishment, part of the yearly celebrations. That December was different, however. It was the first time I was big enough to go up the ladder with him, to look out at the old street below, and see the occasional blink from a weathered set of lights clinging to a neighbor's fence or home. My mom was terrified. She had visions of us both falling to our death, but my dad always seemed sure of himself. Not arrogant, just confident, and cheerfully reminding us all that things would be okay. Looking back, I think that's what I loved about him the most when I was a kid. The fact that he had it all in hand and did everything to reassure his family and friends. I never felt in danger up those ladders. Always loved. Always safe. Always. Before we came down, I remember looking out of the rooftops, poking out in regimented lines from the streets around. I noticed that the world seemed different from up there, and that to me, there appeared to be fewer Christmas lights than ever before. That night, I knew what was coming. My mom tucked me into my bed as my dad finished hanging some paper ring decorations from my bedroom ceiling. I always felt that those decorations protected me somehow. I'd stir in the night, scared of the dark, and yet at Christmas time I believed that somehow those pieces of colored paper, that blinking Christmas tree in the other room, that those symbols, those pieces of goodwill, would keep whatever monstrosities hid in the dark at bay. My mom kissed me on the forehead and left the room. And there was my dad, standing in the corner with his hands behind his back, smiling.
Well, wingman, you know what time it is?
Let me see, Dad, please! From behind his back, he produced an advent calendar. I leapt for joy across the room and hugged him before snatching it from his hands and diving back under the covers. Sitting down on the bed, Dad ruffled my hair with his fingers, watching me curiously. He knew I loved getting an advent calendar each Christmas, and I had worried that I wouldn't get one that year, as he told me that most of the stores were sold out of them. But Dad being Dad, he'd spent hours driving around until he found one, and made sure that on the night of December 1st, the first night of Advent, there it was. The calendar was beautiful, handmade with carefully crafted drawings on its front and back. The lines and sketched colors lovingly showed a Christmas street full of lights, with houses covered in snow and the windows beaming with a warm yellow glow, waiting for the night Santa would arrive. What I loved about each year's Advent calendar, the good ones at least, was that they told a story. They showed something wonderful happening. Each door or window would be opened night upon night, revealing a picture, building until that magical climax of Christmas. I loved the anticipation of the holidays, and the Advent calendar symbolized the hopes that Christmas held. Not just presents, although as a child that was a big part of it, but spending time with my family, seeing my grandparents who usually lived in another part of the country, and getting to eat all the chocolates and turkey I could cram into my mouth. Getting to be away from the boredom of school, getting to play with new toys, getting to have fun with my friends. It was the thought of my friends which brought me down for a moment. There I was, holding an Advent calendar, each cardboard door numbered from 1 to 24, from the 1st of December to Christmas Eve. The same night that 1 year previous, my dear friend Finn had been taken, murdered, and left to rot down a sewer. I began to cry, and almost instinctively my dad seemed to know what was upsetting me. He asked about Finn, and when he mentioned his name, I sobbed deeper than I had since his death. My poor friend, who would never again go on those carefree days out with me and my dad, or walk alongside me to school, laughing and playing. It was then that my father explained to me something about death, words which have always stayed with me.
You know something, kiddo. As long as you keep the memory of the people you've lost in your mind and in your heart, they'll always be alive. They'll always be with you. So Finn is right here.
He pointed to my chest gently. With those words, I felt a soothing comfort wash over me, and, all cried out, my dad tucked me into bed, kissed me on the head, and said good night. knowing to leave my bedroom door open slightly to let some light from the hall keep my room from the dark. He had left the advent calendar sitting nearby, its closed windows facing me from my nightstand. And yet, I was exhausted, and so my thoughts drifted from what lay behind those cardboard doors to sleep, and hopefully to a more rested state of mind. But that did not occur. I woke in the night from a horrendous dream about Finn, little 4-year-old Cheryl, and 11-year-old Tommy Graham, crushed down a sewer pipe, the water running over their bodies into mouths which once spoke and laughed and smiled, only then to be rendered silent by an unseen, brutal hand. In the darkness, Finn's voice cried out, garbled and drowned. A word came forth and clung to me like no other. I leapt out of my bed, soaked in sweat, ready to cry out for my mom and dad. But then something strange caught my attention, shaking me to the core. I looked to the advent calendar, to the drawings of cozy houses covered in snow, their windows beaming out into the cold December night, sitting there waiting almost as I left it. Yet something was amiss, something which I had no memory of. The first advent door had been opened. The cardboard left ajar like the one to my room. Stepping forward, the sweat dripped from my hand as I pulled the door back to reveal what secrets the calendar had in store for me. In what little light there was, I squinted, my mind slowly piecing together the picture behind door number 1. As my eyes adjusted, I recoiled in horror at the sight and screamed for my family. Within seconds, the light was on and my dad appeared, picking me up, consoling me as he put me back into bed. I pointed feverishly over to the calendar, telling him that something awful hid behind the door. Of course he looked, then smiled reassuringly.
It's just a happy Christmas scene, kiddo.
He handed it to me. Looking closely, I could see that the picture had changed slightly. It depicted an old stone bridge covered in snow. Children played on top of it happily. Yes, it appeared quite harmless, quite serene. My father left, and soon I was drifting back to sleep. Yet my mind hazed over with 2 thoughts. Of Finn saying run in my dream, and of what I could have sworn I'd seen in that first little calendar door. The bridge was there, but underneath, in the dark, eyes looked out to the children playing gleefully above, eyes which seemed racked with rage and hate. The next day at school went quickly, but on my way home I dragged my feet over the bitter frozen concrete paths, thinking of Finn and how he had always walked with me. As my house came into view, I smiled for a moment at the lights Dad and I had hung on the roof. They warmed my spirits. But when I entered my room, my soul was chilled stagnant once more. The next advent calendar door had been opened. This time, I knew, I hadn't been there to do such a thing in my sleep as I had assumed must have happened the night before. No, someone had opened it. I touched the yellow number 2 of the cardboard door, a number which should have promised a treat or a happy picture, reminding me that Christmas was near. I hesitated, and then looked behind it. Another street scene played out before me. This time, a small boy pulled a red sled behind him as other children threw snowballs at each other, grinning wide and happy. At first, I sighed with relief that the picture had no hidden intruder, no eyes staring out of the darkness in contempt. But just as I sat the calendar back down onto my nightstand, I saw it. The faint outline of a person looking out toward me, almost invisible, yet hiding within that Christmas scene in plain view, sitting there on the boy's red sled. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, fearful that they might reaffirm the figure's presence once more when opened. But just as the darkened eyes had disappeared from under the bridge on the 1st of December, the faint outline of the unseen pretender had moved on from the picture. I knew that no one would believe me, and even worse, I barely believed it myself. My 9-year-old mind could not comprehend such strange and ominous occurrences, yet I was not so removed from the idea of horrid things scuttling around in the dark, creatures which even my parents could not protect you from. The figure had moved on, I was certain of it, and I knew that it must have traveled and hidden behind the door for the 3rd of December. The next morning, I told myself that I would not open any of the closed doors from the advent calendar. I promised myself. Yet something was doing it for me. That night I awoke in the darkness once more, the same dream playing out, poor Finn muffled and drowning by the putrid sewage water, crying out in the dark, crying out and yet warning, pleading for me to run. Again I leapt from my bed, and once more the calendar door for that day had been opened by an unseen force. There in the dark I looked, compelled by the fear of not looking, the terror of not knowing what was to come. For in that third picture it became clear to me something was on its way. Something unspeakable was plotting, and slowly but surely drawing closer. Behind that door lay another Christmas scene, families skating on a beautiful iced lake, and under that transparent barrier between the cold air and the icy water, there was a shape, darkened, indefinite, but malevolent, a blurred form under the ice, eyes staring up in disgust at the families who happily skated above. I screamed again, and yet the results were all too familiar. My mom and dad arrived tired, yet never annoyed at their child for waking them in the night. Mom put me back to bed, and as she did so I explained frantically to them both that something was appearing in the advent calendar, that each door held proof of something which meant to do me harm. Yet there was no evidence of it, only 3 open doors showing happiness and fun at Christmas. Dad said I was having bad dreams, and that he and Mom would sit with me for a while until I fell asleep. I heard them whispering about work in the morning, but they were more concerned about me than losing a few hours of rest. The next day, again, I tried to ignore the advent calendar, tried desperately to avoid its doors. And again I failed. In the night I awoke from the same hideous dream, and yet this time the calendar was not open. The door with the yellow number 4 remained closed. I hoped that whatever strange thing was in those pictures had left, that I could forget the hateful haunting eyes, and that I could return to simply enjoying the anticipation of Christmas. But just as I nodded back to sleep, happier than I had been since they had first found Finn's body, I heard something. The sound of a thumb or finger pulling at cardboard. I opened my eyes and stared in utter disbelief as the 4th door was pulled open by an invisible hand in the dark. It is strange that I did not scream, but since then I have heard people say that when you are as scared as you can possibly be, that you cannot move, nor can you cry out for help. I opened my mouth, and no noise came, a paralysis of fear that was overpowering. There I lay in the night, staring wide-eyed at the 4th door, wondering what disturbing depiction it would reveal, and even more so, terrified that whatever had opened it still lurked nearby. I wish I could say that it stopped, that the horrid revelation ceased, but I cannot. Some nights, the dreams of Finn telling me to run came, but on others they did not. The only constant was that at some point a calendar door would be opened, whether in the morning or at night. Each door would show a happy scene, and each time something hideous, which only I could see, would be momentarily present. One door showed a group of carolers cheerfully singing at night, warmed by the glow of an open window, and at the rear there stood an outline, something watching, something waiting, something moving on relentlessly to Christmas Eve. The last door. Another picture showed a small girl, no older than poor Cheryl who had been killed, placing presents into a stocking, and yet for a moment there was the faintest impression of a hand reaching out from the stocking toward the girl. By the 20th, the horrific pictures had intensified, as too had the dreams. Finn now screamed my name, his voice echoing up through a drain, pleading with me to get away. And as those night terrors revealed themselves, the pictures had taken on more weight, more immediacy, for I was certain that they now showed the street where I lived. My dad found me crying that night and asked me what was wrong. I told him. I believed that there was something evil coming, something horrendous which had snatched a child each of the previous 3 Christmas Eves, the same evil which had taken my friend, the hidden horror which on Christmas Eve would come for me. Dad reassured me that this was not the case, that I was imagining things. When he looked at the pictures on the calendar, he just saw nondescript streets, anonymous faces, nothing which suggested the place where we lived. But I saw differently. The drawings clearly showed house by house, inch by inch, that something was drawing nearer each day, fleeting glimpses of a faint figure waiting to gorge itself once more. My dad offered to throw the advent calendar away if it was upsetting me so much, but I pleaded with him not to. I needed to know. I had to see what was coming, what was on its way to snatch me from my family as it had done the other children. The 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of December were torturous. While I should have been excited for Christmas Day, I was not. I was terrified, for I knew that I would never live to see it. The calendar door on the 21st, opened by something unseen while I slept, showed a house come into view, one with glowing lights hung around the roof gutter, and the faint outline of something terrible approaching nearby. I was certain that the house was mine, and that the light which beamed outward onto the snowy landscape was for my family. Though as I peered out into the night from my window, there was no snow in reality, just a biting wind and a frost which covered everything like a shroud. I could not see a figure out there, but I felt it, somewhere close, just waiting for Christmas Eve. On the 22nd, the figure drew closer to our home as the snow fell around it in the advent calendar, and on the 23rd the prowler had reached the gate to our garden. That night, I had such a terrible vision. In my dream, I found myself lying in the dark. I could not see, and all that surrounded me was the empty coldness of winter. Pain coursed through my body, and the sound of running water pushed over it, forcing me deeper into the abandoned drain. Putting out my hand instinctively, my fingers touched the frozen mouth of another child. Slowly, it moved against my hand, and its stagnant lips formed a word. I did not wake screaming, nor did I leap from my bed as I had the other nights, like an animal fleeing from a predator. There I lay in the silence of the night, and in that stillness, I cried. The paper chains and decorations my family had hung from my room's ceiling proved no protection from the pain or from the thoughts of the other 3 children, how they had been taken, and how I would be next. And then the day had come. Christmas Eve. I was frightened, but a distance took me, one which slowed my words and left me dispassionate about the festive season, about my family. I wish I had not been that way, and had savored every moment I had left, but I was drained, numbed by the lurking fear which had haunted me for weeks, tired of it all, a strain which no 9-year-old should have had to bear. My dad knew that I wasn't my usual self, as I normally relish Christmas Eve like most children, excited and completely enthused for what would come. But there I was, outside in the cold, helping him fix part of the lights which had come unhooked in the wind. I watched my dad on the ladders once more, the wind rattling everything around, the slates on the roof, the trees, the gutter. I thought about how Finn's family, or little Cheryl's, or even Tommy Graham's would have been preparing for Christmas Day like we were, happily unaware of the loss they were about to undergo. At least I knew. I had foresight, each hideous picture hinting at that faint figure coming closer and closer to my home, to open my window as I slept, waiting for Christmas morning, to snatch me from my bed, to slaughter me, discarding my body down a sewer pipe, used and forgotten. As the wind howled and the lights chinked and jingled together, I looked back at the gate to our garden, to where I had seen my future attacker. I could see nothing, just an empty street on the quietest night of the year. But in that absence, I could feel eyes bearing into me. My dad climbed down the ladder, whistling merrily to himself, and as I looked up at him, I simply asked, matter-of-factly, if he would nail my window shut. He didn't ask why. He knew many parents had done the same, and so we went inside as the evening rolled in, carried by the promise of frost from the outskirts of the city. Dad got his toolbox out and drove a large series of nails into the frame of the window. Once I was confident that there was no way to open it, I thanked him and asked if he would do one more thing for me. Only one. To sit next to my bed all night and look over me until morning. Unlike the other nights, he did not tell me that there was no monstrosity out there, nor did he say that the world was a safe place, for that would have been a lie. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said,
"If you need me, I'll sit right here until it's time to open the presents."
And sit there he did. My mother came in to kiss me on the head before returning back to the kitchen, where she was preparing things for dinner the next day. I so wanted to see it. Presents meant nothing to me by that night. All I cared about was being there at the family table, laughing with Gramps and Gran, knowing that the nightmare of December 1965 was over. I fell asleep as my dad sat by the bed, reading his book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke. I was unsure of the precise time, but what I knew was that my dad was standing at my window, looking down, out to the street below. I whispered to him and asked what was wrong, but his reply was hesitant.
"Nothing, kiddo. Go back to sleep."
Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps slowly walking up our garden path outside, shambling forward toward our home. The sound frightened me, and my thoughts immediately turned to the advent calendar, to the faint outlined figure which had haunted me. From what little light there was, I could see that the door for Christmas Eve was sealed shut, yet to be opened. The footsteps continued, one after the other, slowly, steadily. My dad stared intently outside as I asked if he could see anyone there, but he just shook his head in disbelief. The footsteps ceased, and silence covered everything like the frost outside. Suddenly, it was broken by 3 loud, booming knocks. It was at our door. I cried out in terror and started sobbing.
It's come to take me, Dad, like Finn and the others.
I howled in utter despair as the tears slid down my cheeks.
"Nonsense. It must be a neighbor or something,"
my dad said unconvincingly.
No, Dad, he's here to take me away.
I screamed as I handed the calendar to him.
Open the last door. Open it and you'll see. Christmas Eve, each Christmas Eve, it takes a child, and if you open that, you'll see it. I promise you'll see it.
3 more loud knocks echoed out, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across my dad's face as I could hear my mom stirring from her room, shouting through, asking what was going on. 3 knocks once more, this time more pronounced.
Please, Dad, look at the door. Open it and you'll believe me. It's here for me.
My father's hand trembled. Slowly, he opened the last door to see what was shown.
"God, no!"
And with that we heard the most hideous of sounds, one which was laced with dread. A click of a lock, the turning of a handle, and the front door opening to the cold. Then, footsteps climbing stairs, looking, seeking, slowly coming down the hall toward my room.
Dad, please help me!
I pleaded as the nightmarish thing in our house drew closer. He looked at me, trying his best to hide his fear, but I could see it etched into his face, into his soul.
"Listen to me, daughter. As soon as I go out there, I need you to grab all your things, anything heavy, and barricade your door. Don't let anyone in this room, unless it's me or your mother."
I believe in that moment he saw the utter despair in my eyes, and before he left the room, as the footsteps reached the room next to mine, he spoke gently, patting me on the head.
"It'll be okay."
Then he was gone. I did as he said, and as soon as he had left the room, I moved my nightstand, my chair, my books, anything I could against the door, sobbing my eyes out, praying that my parents were safe. At first, I heard nothing throughout our house. Then suddenly, violent shouting erupted. A struggle quickly followed, with what sounded like furniture being thrown and glass smashed. And then the worst of it, my mother screaming. She cried and yelled and agonized. And finally, I could not bear it anymore. I could not leave her alone. Clearing the things away from my door, I opened it and went down the darkened hall. A cold, icy air blew through the house. The front door lay open, decorations swung in the frozen breeze, and outside knelt my mother, alone, terrified, screaming into the night. Losing a parent is hard for a child, and to do so on Christmas Eve, harder still. Yet the torture of that night cuts deeper than most. Few can know my true pain. Over the years, I have tried to understand it more clearly, understand what my life was before and what it is now, to little avail. I cannot give solid explanations, nor can I say that my anger will ever truly diminish. I've tried to live as best I can, putting the misery out of my mind each year, that is, until Christmas, when the memories flood back like a comforting blanket, soon torn away by a silent hand from the dark. My own children, now grown up, have asked me why I become a little distant at this time of year, and to that I have given no real answer. All I can say is this: I do know two things, both of which haunt me to this day. The first is that no one ever saw or heard from my dad again. My mother remained tight-lipped until she died about what had come into her house that night, what took her husband, and who could blame her. I also know what the last door of the Advent calendar contained, and what had frightened my dad so badly. It was a drawing, like the others, a happy Christmas scene, with one horrid addition. It showed a boy, sleeping soundly in his bed on Christmas Eve. A child who looked uncannily like my poor friend Finn, unaware that his life would soon be over, and that he was being watched through the frosted window by his killer, whose face looked remarkably like that of my father's.